When Donald Trump unleashed a fresh trade war against China, many people thought it would simply be a matter of time before they were forced to buckle. They sell nearly $600 billion worth of goods to the US every year, and depend on them for 15% of all of their exports. On the surface, it seemed obvious that they couldn't survive. But what they did next shocked the world. Instead of flinching, they fired back, fast, matching tariffs, cutting off key exports, and sending a clear message: we don't care. But something doesn't make sense. How can a country seemingly dependent on selling goods survive without its biggest customer? Well, behind the scenes, something has changed. Over the past decade, China has secretly been rebuilding the foundations of its economy. Instead of spending, they're investing, with 40% of their annual GDP being poured into investments every year, almost double that of any other major economy. And the results are hard to ignore. Chinese firms are rising to replace US companies at the top of the food chain. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the biggest EV manufacturer. TikTok has become one of the biggest and fastest growing social media platforms in the world, and Chinese brands everywhere are quickly moving up the chain. China isn't just trying to survive without the US, it's showing the world that it can lead without it. So, has China actually made itself economically indestructible, or is this all just smoke and mirrors? You've probably seen the headlines: China's property market collapsing, the economy crumbling under an aging population, and millions of unemployed youth. And yet, mega factories are being built daily. High-speed rail now connects the entire country, and some of the most advanced technology on Earth no longer comes from the West. So which China is real? The truth is both. The West is caught between these two conflicting realities, struggling to understand the new China. Because the story we've told ourselves for decades is starting to fall apart. Ever since they opened up to trade in the 1970s, China's economic rise has been fueled by the West. The largest population came with low wages, and China took advantage of it to become a manufacturing hub. They built factories for Apple, powered Amazon's supply chain, and attracted billions in Western investment. From the 1990s through the 2000s, China's economy grew at an astonishing pace, averaging nearly 10% annual GDP growth for years. The model was simple: China made and America bought. It was fast, cheap, and efficient, but also deeply dependent. For decades, the US and China were deeply intertwined trading partners. China became the world's factory floor, exporting cheap goods to American consumers and attracting trillions worth of foreign investment each year. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy, and its factories weren't just cheap anymore, they were also getting smarter. In places like Shenzhen, the same assembly lines that once churned out knockoffs had slowly learned from their experience, now producing cutting-edge technology at a fraction of the cost of America. At the same time, the US kept on importing more and more from them. By 2018, China's trade surplus with the US had ballooned to over $400 billion, and concerns over economic dependency were starting to grow. The idea that a rising authoritarian power could hold this much control over global supply chains, and by extension, the American economy as a whole, became a threat too big to ignore. To make matters worse, from 2001 to 2017, the US lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, many of them outsourced to China, and gradually, the media and politicians began to point fingers. Chinese firms were thriving in the US market, scooping up market share, cutting prices, and scaling fast. But American companies, they couldn't break into China in the same way. Many began accusing the Chinese government of playing dirty, handing out money to firms to make their goods cheaper, and protecting their biggest companies with anti-competition laws so their foreign competitors didn't stand a chance. The idea of confronting China was starting to gain momentum, and when Donald Trump first ran for president in 2016 on a promise to take on China's trade practices once and for all, he won. Almost immediately after taking office, he kept his promise, slapping trade tariffs on hundreds of billions worth of Chinese goods. The logic was simple: raise the costs of importing from China and push American companies to bring production back home, protecting domestic manufacturing. But that still wasn't enough. The US also protected its decade-old technological advancement and did everything in their power to stop China from gaining the upper hand. They blacklisted Huawei, barred American companies from selling critical chips, and restricted China's access to advanced semiconductors. This wasn't just about trade anymore, it was strategic dominance. From 2018 to 2020, the tension just escalated, and then it simmered under Biden. He didn't aggressively increase the tariffs like Trump did, but he also didn't reduce them either. The direction was clear: the decoupling had begun. And by 2025, under a second Trump presidency, the conflict came roaring back. A fresh wave of tariffs were announced, targeting Chinese EVs, solar equipment, batteries, and key tech components. Some tariffs reached 100%, sending a clear message: we're done with being dependent.
But this time, something was different. The first time around, China was cautious. It negotiated, compromised, tried to de-escalate. But now, China fired back immediately, matching tariffs, banning rare earth exports, and blacklisting American firms. This wasn't the China of 2001, or even 2016. This was a new China. bolder, more self-assured, and ready to fight back. And to many in the West, it was a wake-up call. Had China quietly built an economy that no longer needed the US? The trade war was no longer just about trade. It had become a battle over who gets to shape the future of the global economy, and for the first time in decades, the US may not have the final say. Beijing knows exactly what the rest of the world suspects: that a giant built on exports can't survive if the world stops buying. So, over the past decade, China has been quietly trying to rewire its economy from a machine fueled by American demand into a system that can run on its own. At the heart of this transformation was a concept introduced by Xi Jinping, a strategy known as dual circulation, which will lay the blueprint for an entirely new kind of Chinese economy, one designed to be resilient, self-sustaining, and far less exposed to the West. Here's how it works. The first engine, internal circulation, focuses on strengthening domestic demand. It's about turning China's 1.4 billion citizens into the main driver of its own growth. That means promoting household consumption, building local supply chains, and investing in homegrown innovation. The second engine, external circulation, keeps global trade alive, but with a twist. Instead of relying heavily on the US and Europe, China is forging new trade routes and diversifying its partners across the global south: Asian, African, Latin American, the Middle East, and it's already reshaping the entire structure of China's economy. Despite the age-old image of China as an export-driven powerhouse, the numbers tell a different story. They're not as reliant on external consumption as you may think. In 2024, domestic consumption actually made up 45% of GDP, more than double that of exports, and it's actually been this way for a while. Over the past decade, household consumption has consistently contributed to at least half of China's GDP growth, meaning that the vast majority of its output is actually consumed domestically. Chinese people are buying home-produced Chinese cars, electronics, and even Chinese luxury brands. But no matter how good that sounds, this level of consumption is still very weak, especially when compared to other major economies, where we regularly see household spending more than 60 to 70% of GDP. And while the Chinese government has tried to get more people spending through policies like cheap loans and subsidized trade-in programs, most families are still playing it safe, cutting back on debt and saving money instead. Why? Because the real problem remains unchecked. Despite being a socialist country, social safety nets like unemployment benefits and pension support are almost non-existent. China spends less than 1% of their GDP on safety net programs, one of the lowest levels in the world, making it incredibly hard for people to weather economic shocks, job losses, or health emergencies. At the same time, its housing market is in crisis. Ever since 2019, China's property value growth has constantly been declining, and now many homes are even losing their value, with houses costing an average of 4.5% less than they did last year. And if that wasn't enough, China's shrinking birth rates have shrunk to the point where more people are dying than being born. And if this continues, they are on track to have one of the fastest aging and shrinking workforces in the world. This makes many families feel pressure to save for healthcare, retirement, or their children's education. So while domestic consumption is certainly growing, it still hasn't taken over the entire economy just yet. The truth is, China's economy still leans heavily on factories, exports, and investment. But the shift to consumer spending is real, even if it's slow. That's the whole point of this dual circulation model. Not to end trade with the world, but to survive without being dependent on it. China wants to become resilient, to build an economy that won't collapse if US consumers stop buying, or if the West imposes new sanctions. So while the transformation isn't finished, one thing is clear. China isn't just playing defense, it's building an economic system designed to outlast the storm. A key part of this strategy is shifting trading partners. As the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu once said, "Do not depend on the enemy not coming, but depend rather on being ready for him." China isn't betting on the world staying friendly, it's preparing for a future where it doesn't have to ask. In 2000, America bought over 20% of China's exports, but by 2023, that number had dropped to only 15%. On the surface, it looked like China was losing ground as exports to their biggest market fell, but in reality, its global export share kept rising. China hasn't changed how much it's exporting, but rather who those goods were going to. From Southeast Asia to South America, Chinese goods are everywhere, and the Asian countries are now China's top trading partner. In Africa, Chinese investment in infrastructure has captured the hunger for their abundant minerals. In Latin America and the Middle East, demand for Chinese machinery, energy tech, and consumer products is booming. Piece by piece, China is steadily shifting away from resilience on developed markets like the US and pivoting towards the global south. And how did they do that? They built railways through the mountains of Laos, ports in Sri Lanka, highways in Kenya, power plants in Pakistan. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious strategy launched in 2013 to connect China to the rest of the world through infrastructure by funding and building major projects all across the globe, and it has become the backbone of China's strategy to forge strong relationships with new potential trading partners. Since its launch, China has spent over $1 trillion funding this mega project, and at first many of the West mocked it for its overreach, too ambitious, too expensive, but a decade later, the results are hard to ignore. By 2024, over 140 countries have joined the BRI, collectively representing nearly 75% of the world's population. But Belt and Road isn't just about roads and bridges, it's about influence. By financing essential infrastructure in countries where Western investment was minimal, China has embedded itself into the economic lifelines, and in return it's gaining loyal trading partners, securing demand for Chinese products, and most of all reducing its dependency on the US. The numbers speak for themselves. The group of Asian countries has now overtaken the US to become China's largest trading partner, buying up $500 billion worth of Chinese exports in 2024 alone. At the same time, they've become the biggest trading partner of South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and many other key members of the BRICS alliance, a group of rising economies in the global south who now make up 45% of the entire global population. Despite this, the US still remains significant to China, and moving away from such a powerful market will no doubt still hurt them. But the shift shows how China now has an increasingly diverse and growing network of new partners. It's no longer just a factory for the West, it's become a hub of new global trade. And if this bet works, it could redefine not just trade routes, but the balance of power. But China knows it can't just rely on consumers and trade alone. To truly stand out, it must build a powerful engine underneath, one fueled by massive investment, cutting-edge technology, and rock-solid infrastructure. Since 2018, China has poured more than $500 billion into R&D. It's subsidizing strategic industries, trying to outcompete the West by being able to independently produce and gain control over some of the most advanced technology on Earth. Take semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. When the US slapped export bans on key chips, making equipment and targeted Huawei with sanctions, many assumed China's ambitions would be crushed. But instead, Huawei shocked the world in 2023 by unveiling a homegrown 7nm chip, a breakthrough only possible because of massive state investment in domestic technology. And at the same time, Chinese chip makers like SMIC are closing the gap, producing increasingly advanced chips to fuel everything from 5G networks to electric vehicles. And on the EV front, things are going just as well. BYD has overtaken Tesla as the world's largest electric car maker in 2022 and remained in front ever since. It's not just cars and chips. China's infrastructure is also staggering, with a high-speed rail network which stretches over 40,000 kilometers, longer than the rest of the world combined, paired with ports, green energy projects, and digital infrastructure, all expanding at breakneck speed to fuel the new economy. They now produce roughly 1 in 3 of all manufactured goods in the entire world. In many industries, China is making far more than what the market needs. More steel than it can use, more solar panels than it can install, and more EVs than it can sell domestically. To many in the West, this seemed like a looming overcapacity problem. By overloading the market with too much supply, prices will fall, making the industry less profitable than it could be. But to China, overcapacity isn't a flaw, it's being used as a weapon. By flooding the world with affordable goods, China embeds itself into crucial parts of global supply chains. Europe needs Chinese solar panels to power their green transition. American EVs need Chinese batteries to run, and buildings all across Asia need Chinese steel. So instead of a weakness, the more that China makes, the more the world depends on it, and it becomes harder and harder to say no to China. This transformation was powered by a system unique to China, state-led capitalism. But this level of control also comes with a cost. Unlike the West, where private capital often drives innovation, much of China's transformation has been funded directly by the state. To keep the engine running, China has had to keep on spending, and they were forced to lean heavily on borrowed money, piling up public debt at a pace not seen in decades. By 2026, China is continued to pass 100% levels of debt to GDP, and this could be signalling a risk that China is fueling growth faster than it can absorb it. We've seen this before. Ghost cities, idle factories, high-speed rail lines with too few passengers. If China keeps on building more than the economy can realistically use, all of this investment could end up sitting idle. The US-China relationship is no longer what it used to be. The days of quiet interdependence, where China made and American bought, are over. In some ways, China no longer needs the US like it once did. It's built new factories, new trade routes, and new alliances. It's pouring trillions into its own technology, feeding its own consumer market, and investing in an economic machine designed to weather whatever storms may come. But that doesn't mean it's untouchable. China hasn't fully replaced the West. Its consumers don't spend like Americans, its chip industry still lags behind, and its economy still bears the scars of a property crisis, sluggish demand, and mounting debt. What China isn't doing is retreating, it's rebuilding. Quietly, steadily, it's crafting something else, a parallel economic system, one less exposed to US pressure and more embedded across the global south. Because this isn't just about trade wars or sanctions anymore, it's about whether the US can still call shots in a world where China no longer plays by its rules. The age of American-led globalization is fading, and the question isn't if China will survive, it's how the rest of the world will adapt.